We went back to school, but I couldn't stand it. I'd always been a very good student. I generally was one of the best in the class. But I'd study my lessons, and then when it came time to recite the lessons, I couldn't remember, and it broke my heart. It made me cry. And we talked to the doctor about it, and he said, well, it's just because you're so weak. So he said, the best thing for you to do is to go out to the farm. And so we went out to the farm and stayed there all summer and did all the things that you've heard me talking about on these tapes. And by the time fall came and school started, then we were completely healthy again, and I was able to go back to school and the rest of them and to do our usual work, which was good work. All of my older brothers and sisters went to a country school. I don't know whether it was a little red schoolhouse such as is traditional, but it was a country school, just one-room country school, and generally the one teacher that was there had all the grades. But by the time Edna and I and Milton were ready for school, our parents were older, and the older boys and girls were able to do the work on the farm. So they decided to move to town, and we at first rented a house in town and later bought a house in town so we could stay in town and go to school. And Tante was my mother's sister who made her home with us. And Tante is the German word for aunt. Generally, an older person like that, an aunt or an older woman living with their cousin was called a Tante. Well, Tante would go to town and live with us. Well, Tante was a small, rather kind of chunky woman, but not very tall, and was very excitable. And she would get real put out when we boys were naughty, and she would try to spank us. Well, she had a stiff arm. Her right arm was stiff, and she was right-handed, of course, and she would try to spank us for stealing cookies that she'd tried to hide or something like that. And we learned that by standing real close to her, that she couldn't wave her arm. All she could do was just turn her wrist. And you see, you try it. Hold your arm stiff and put a stick in your hand and try to spank somebody with that stick. You can't hit very hard. So that's one of the tricks we learned to overcome her punishment of us. But I got one spanking I'll never forget, and for which I'll always be grateful. My brother Clarence was 16 at the time he died of typhoid fever, and it was in the earlier part of the fall that he came in from the farm, and he came in late to school because the farm work was heavy, and then started school and was with us in town and expecting to be there all winter. And then, of course, he got sick and died. But before, while he was still well, he was there. And I remember Edna and I got in a fight one day, and I called her some vulgar name. Well, Clarence was the oldest one there, and Clarence took me down in the basement and gave me a real spanking. He really tanned my bottom. Well, I didn't like it at the time, but I remember it with great gratitude, especially in view of the fact that so soon afterward he died, because he taught me that you can't get away with that kind of stuff. That even a 10-year-old boy had an obligation to be a gentleman. Well, here I am at 75 years of age past, retired for 10 years. And this was not meant to be a life history. For years, Our girls, especially Valerie and Beatrice and Barbara, have been urging me to write or to record some of these stories, and I have procrastinated always. But thanks to Brad's visit this time and Barb's presence here for these days, to urge me a little bit and to remind me of some incidents, I've applied myself and made these tapes. In a letter that we received from Bee the other day, she enclosed an account of a fishing episode on one of our vacations in Minnesota years ago when she was a little girl. And I presume that she did this as a model, maybe in her schoolroom in Pryor, Oklahoma, to encourage her children to write up their experiences. And the thing brought back so many memories that I'm going to ask Barbara, who is here and will be leaving tonight, and incidentally taking this tape with her to California. I'm going to ask Barb to record this story, this fishing story of Bee up in Minnesota. Barb and Valerie and Bee's voices are all so similar that when they call long distance, I always have a little time until I'm real sure who it is. So the next voice you hear will be that of Barbara recording Bee's story of an event up at the lake in Minnesota where our family had so many, many happy vacations.
Lots of our happiest childhood memories are wrapped up with going to the lake in Minnesota, so it's fun to read this story that Bee has written. This windy afternoon reminds me of another windy day years ago when I was with my family on vacation in Minnesota. It was not a windy afternoon, however, but a windy morning. This particular morning, my dad, my brother, and I had gotten up at about 4 o'clock. My older sister Valerie had planned to go the night before, but when Daddy wakened her, she demurred, saying that she had forgotten how dark it was at 4 a.m., and that she guessed she'd go back to sleep and help Mother in the cabin later instead. That suited Doug and me just fine, because we always had more fun, just the two of us with our dad, than with her along, having to split the attention another way. I think Daddy fixed hot cereal for all of us over the kerosene stove. It's different getting ready and eating at a time like that when it's earlier than you almost ever get up and when you're trying to make not a sound. Of course, you have to make some noise opening drawers and getting up off the bed where you sat to put on your shoes. Then to talk, you have to wave your arms to try to get the other guy's attention, and once you get it, you mouth the words to make him understand, which is not so easy when all the light in the three-room cabin is 2 kerosene lanterns. But I'm off my story. We loaded up and pushed off from the dock, and with my dad rowing and my brother and I huddling fore and aft to keep warm. Minnesota mornings are cold enough for winter coats, hats, and gloves, even in July and August when you're out on the lake before the sun comes up. Our technique usually was to row to the near end of the lake, round the bend clockwise past the lily pads, up along the docks at the point, through the narrows to the inlet, and on into the small lower end of the lake by Weedle's Resort. Beginning there, we'd cast in toward shore with our frog harnesses and other weedless baits, trying to make our casts in just at the outside of the reeds that lined the bank for a depth of some 20 feet out from shore. Bass, the largemouth variety, often lay there between feeding times, and at feeding time would dart into shallower water after the frogs, beetles, so forth. On this trip I'm describing, we'd been out for hours, taking turns rowing and casting, always keeping 2 poles in the water, and 3 if it was my dad's turn to row because he could cast at the same time, and had made it back as far as the lily pads at the end of the lake when suddenly a violent wind blew up. Summer storms are common in Minnesota, but they mostly arise in the mid-afternoon. Before I could react, the wind had blown us sideways, and I, even at 11, was an experienced rower. Just as suddenly the fish started hitting the bait like fireworks exploding. And in the next instant the rain started and dropped so large they slapped one's face in the driving wind. My dad was calling instructions to me at the same time that he was exclaiming, "I've got one! It's a big one! Oh, he got away! There! Oh, he hit hard! I hope he's hooked good!" "I got one too," Doug shouted, and that's the way it went for who knows how long. You lose track of time in moments like these. My dad and brother pulled in 9 good-sized bass and a couple of northern, while I struggled, not too successfully, to keep the boat at right angles to the waves. This time, instead of a 20-minute or so cloudburst, as was typical, it continually darkened, and presently my dad, in a time-out after stringing one fish and before casting again, chanced to look up and around and was brought back to the reality of the possible danger we were in. "Here, Bee," he said, "you change places with me. We'd better get back into shore. Doug, you keep casting." His strong stroke started us moving in a concerted direction toward our dock. I don't remember landing, but I do remember the changes of mood as we went from intense excitement and even alarm to the quiet, cozy security of the shore and the cabin.
When I ended the last tape, I was talking about the little church on our farm and how the men sat on one side, that is the men and the boys, and the women and the girls sat on the other side. My father took the initiative in breaking up that custom. He would go and sit on the women's side with my mother, or she would come over and sit on the men's side with my father. And then when my older brothers began dating, they would go over and sit by their girlfriends, or have their girlfriends come over and sit on the men's side. And so it was that this broke up that old habit or that old custom of separating the men from the women. But one of the most important influences in my life wasn't formal or organized at all. And it was the influence that my father had on me because of his love for that little church. He did many things in that church. He was a deacon, and he was a trustee, and he was a Sunday school superintendent, and he played the organ, which is a little hand organ, you know, the one that you pump, old-fashioned organ. Did many things like that. But among them was the fact that he was the one who kept the church clean. And he and my brother Milton and I used to go down and sweep the church, and generally he would sit down at the organ and play some of the hymns. And I remember he used to take some flowers, roses and that kind of thing, and plant around the church. And the loving care that he gave that church and the joy with which he did it, I think was one of the great influences of causing me to love the church and to choose the ministry as a life work. When I was about 11 years old, my mother said to me one day, she said, "Elmer, don't you think it's time that you gave your heart to the Lord Jesus?" Well, that was her way of putting it, and I understood what she meant. In other words, what she meant was that the time she thought might have come when I should think of a personal response to the influence of Jesus on my life. So that night, when I knelt by my bed, as sincerely as anything I ever did, I prayed, and I dedicated my life to God. Some other things happened that I didn't understand so well. For example, we had revival meetings, and those revival meetings were emotional affairs, and pressure was brought up on us to make a decision, and this was confusing to me and repugnant to me. And so now, and for many years, I have looked back upon that night I knelt by my bed as the bright and shining hour of my life in which I made my own dedication to Jesus Christ. My images of the Christian faith have changed greatly, And if I had to take my religion in the context in which I received it way back then, I wouldn't be able to do it. But that experience, I think, is the most important experience of my life, and I'm very grateful for it. Take a little breather here, wait a few moments, and then start the tape again at this point. Along the line that I've been talking, I think also of the things that have influenced me to make further decisions in my life. On the farm, a boy, especially a 10 or 12-year-old boy or 15-year-old boy, has a lot of time to think. And I had a lot of time to myself. I used to go out in the field to herd cattle on ground that we had plowed in the springtime, where we planned to plant wheat in the fall. And grass came up, and especially what we called wild oats, or wheat